All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Glenn Ruga from the Social Documentary Network and Zeke Magazine. And oh my God, it's so great to see so many faces out there from all parts of the world. I'd like to recognize our partner with Documentary Matters, Digital Silver Imaging from Belmont, Massachusetts. And Andrea Zaki from DSI would like to say hello in a few words.
Excuse me.
Bless you, Barbara.
Thank you.
I'd like to basically first, I want to thank Glenn and Barbara. I think, today, now more than ever, we can really see the importance of documentary photography. And I'm so glad and proud that we're a supporter of SDN and other great documentary organizations like Photoville and Catchlight Foundation. And just today, before I got on, actually, Barbara, I saw one of your photographs online from LA. And it's just such important work that's being done right now. So I think this is a very timely webinar. And again, we are honored to be a sponsor here. And just our little housekeeping, we are open for a limited print production. So if you need a print, we can do that. And I just want to say to everybody to support a documentary photographer, maybe buy a print from them. Or subscribe to a local newspaper or organization and support SDN by all means. If you don't subscribe to Zeke Magazine right after the webinar, you should get on there and get a subscription. So thank you, Glenn, and thank you, Barbara. And that's all I really have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you for giving a plug for Zeke Magazine, so I don't need to do it. Barbara Davidson, your ID says PhotoSpice. So just people know that when it says PhotoSpice, that's Barbara Davidson, one of our featured speakers.
Yeah,
Barbara, you could change that if you want, but it's fine that you keep that. I'd like to remind people about the SDN Pandemic in Focus call for entries that we're currently conducting. There's no cost to submit work to this call for entries. All that is required is that your work in some way addresses the global pandemic. And then selected work submitted to this will be featured on the SDN website, in the SDN social media, and selected work will also be featured in the upcoming fall issue of Zeke Magazine. So you can find more about this on the SDN website. And just a reminder, starting a month ago, all new exhibits submitted to the SDN website are free for the first year. So back in early March, when the coronavirus landed on the US soil, and it became clear that it was spreading through the fabric of our communities, it was impossible to begin any conversation or stage any event without mention of this terrible disease and the toll that it was about to take, and it was taking. The havoc and disruption was unprecedented for any of our lives. Now, almost 3 months later, our nation is again being torn apart by another virus, one that has been with us for over 400 years, the disease of racism, hatred, and bigotry. Neither a civil war, a civil rights era, a great society, overthrowing fascism in Europe, nor technology that brought man to the moon or brought us supercomputers in our pockets have provided a vaccination or cure for this insidious disease. George Floyd, a 59-year-old Black man, was tortured and murdered a little over a week ago by a white police officer from Minneapolis. Within hours, the whole world saw this event. It was one too many men and women whose lives have been stopped short by the original sin in America. This past month, there are other Black lives unjustly and viciously ended in the United States, including Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor. The coronavirus has taken more than 100,000 lives in the US in less than 3 months, and a disproportionate number of the victims have been Black and brown. How many millions of lives of African Americans have been taken in 400 years? It has to stop now, today. The violence we're seeing today in our cities has to stop, but so does the root cause of this violence. If there is no justice, there will be no peace. For 12 years, the Social Documentary Network has published thousands of stories from across the world, but one too common theme is about the conditions of African Americans here in the US. No matter the oppression that people live under anywhere in the world, people still have inherent dignity, pride, and tenacity to create fruitful lives. We celebrate the human spirit wherever we can, but we also condemn the oppression of people anywhere and the people who perpetuate this oppression. The coronavirus will pass. The question is, what condition will our society be in its wake? I can't be assured that racism in the US will pass, and it certainly won't be as quickly. Today, we're privileged to have with us 3 photographers who have turned their creative focus and energy most recently on one of these viruses, the coronavirus, and how it is affecting our communities here in the US and in Latin America. The prior work of each of these photographers also speaks to the oppression of the disenfranchised. We have with us Rania Matar, born and raised in Lebanon, now a Guggenheim Fellow living in Brookline, Massachusetts, who many of us know from her amazing photographs. Her first book, Ordinary Lives, documents the beautiful and difficult and impossible lives of Palestinian refugees living in camps in Lebanon for generations. Her second book, A Girl in Her Room, are extraordinarily sensitive portraits of teenage girls in both suburban Boston and in Lebanon, in their very personal bedroom spaces. Her third book, L'Enfant Femme, presents us younger adolescent girls from the same 2 countries. Rania now brings us window portraits shot during the pandemic and recently featured in the Boston Globe. Rania does the impossible and takes personal and revealing portraits when the whole world is saying to keep our distance. We also have with us Barbara Davidson, a Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award-winning photographer, director, who is currently working on a Guggenheim Fellowship photographing survivors of gun violence across the United States. Formerly a staff photographer with the Los Angeles Times, she spent the past decade photographing women and children trapped in a culture of poverty and guns. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus, she is now focusing on the core of what documentary photographers do best, photographing ordinary people and how they adapt to difficult life situations. In this case, showing us how they cope with the virus running rampant through their city of Los Angeles. People go on with their lives, they wear masks, they keep their distance, they do their jobs, and they live their lives. Barbara brings us these stunning photos through her popular Instagram feed, Photospice. And more recently, this past week, Barbara's also been photographing the protests and demonstrations and violence in Los Angeles. And these photos are also available on her Instagram feed. And Barbara was recently featured in a New York Times article about violence against journalists, where she was assaulted by a policeman in Los Angeles. Lastly, we have with us João Pina, a 2017 Nieman Fellow, originally from Portugal and now based in Latin America. In 2007, he published his first book, Por Tu Livre Pensamento, featuring the stories of 25 former Portuguese political prisoners. In 2014, he published Condor, documenting the remnants of large-scale secret military operations to eliminate political opposition to the military dictatorships in South America during the 1970s. In 2018, he published 46750, focusing on the ongoing urban violence in Rio de Janeiro and the city's transformation over the past decade while preparing for the 2016 Olympic Games. And just last month, he published an article in National Geographic about the largest residential apartment building in Latin America in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The building houses 500 people in close quarters while struggling to stay safe. And meanwhile, the president of Brazil scoffs at the virus and said it is nothing more than the sniffles. Now Brazil is the new epicenter of the virus in Latin America. So each photographer will present their work for 15 minutes, then we'll have a brief conversation among the 4 of us, and then we'll open it up for questions with everybody. And Rania, why don't you begin? Rania Matar.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. So nice to see so many friendly faces of some people that I know, some names that I know, but that I haven't met. So hi, everybody. Glenn, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this. It was lovely to meet Barbara and João, and I'm honored to be presenting next to them. So I'm going to start, I'm going to share my screen and tell you a little bit what I have been doing. If I could figure that, share view. Okay, so I was okay. I just put that as I started that. Yeah, I changed that my opening page yesterday because I thought that was a very appropriate image. These were two sisters that I have photographed through the window. So for me, it's kind of playing on the two things that are happening at the moment. And somebody sent me that quote that I loved: "If the house of the world is dark, love will find a way to create windows." So it seemed appropriate on many levels, by Rumi. I just want to put the work that I'm making in the context of what I was doing and how the work came to be about. I started it by honoring a few of the African-American women that I had photographed. I had been working, and this is the project that I got the Guggenheim for, and I had been working on for the past 2 years, is I was, all my work, as you said, is often focused on women and the relationship with the environment, whether it was in the refugee camps or in the girls' bedroom. And all of it has been following my own identity and my own daughter's identity as they're growing up. And I started this project focusing on young women when they leave the home in their early 20s and the relationship they make with the environment that they're in. So the environment is always very important in my work. And this one was very much an emphasis on texture and physicality. And I'm gonna just show these few images because I had been, the first 2 weeks of lockdown, I was editing for this work that I'm starting to work toward a book on. And I had it all laid out on my floor. And as I was editing the work and kept looking at it, I realized how many windows I had. And so it was all, I'm just talking about how organically a project comes to me. And there was always this sense of, often that sense of the inside and the outside and that relationship to it. So I just became obsessed with that, the fact that we're inside right now looking out. And from here, I was one time sitting in my kitchen and looking out the window, and actually it was happening on a few days in a row, and all of a sudden it clicked in my head, and I would see my neighbor 2 yards across our 2 yards on her window, and she would be sitting on the sill reading, and sometimes we wave at each other, and I'm like, oh my God, this is beautiful. This should be my project. So it kind of very organically started, and I went ahead and I put this picture that I had made before in 2014, I believe, on Instagram, saying that I just came up with this idea and I would love to photograph people that I could access within a driving distance from Brookline. I went ahead and bought a medium format digital camera for this. I had been shooting film all along. I felt that there's an immediacy to this project that I needed to, sorry, I'm not able to go forward. Yeah, there's an immediacy to this project that I needed to grab right away, and I didn't want to wait 2 months to get the film developed and then have it scanned and look at it. And besides, I'm also working through the windows, there's so much reflection and so many unknowns that I felt like I wanted to see the process as it's happening. So people started replying to my Instagram posts. Some people I knew, some people I didn't, and so it kind of very organically evolved. So I would go to people's home with my little step stool, my mask, and my camera, and we started collaborating. And what was interesting to me, as you were mentioning, my pictures tend to be very intimate, and this is important to me to develop, and that intimacy when I work with people. And here I'm photographing people through a barrier. So basically, I'm basically screaming for them to hear me, and then we're gesturing for them to move up or down depending on the reflection. And it became a challenge for me about how to make that work have that same level of poignancy or intimacy that I usually try to get with my work. So I'm going to go through some of the images. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time going. Okay. So it quickly became collaborative, and I realized, I love some of this image, especially what I was doing before with the relationship with the landscape started happening in some weird way through the windows, because there's all that landscape being reflected in the window. And so I'm photographing a person who's inside, but this person is reflected on the, I mean, on where I'm standing. So it's like everything is blurred in this time that we are living, and it felt like there was a blurriness of that aspect that was happening here. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time moving my slides forward. And sometimes there were wonderful surprises that would happen as well. So again, it was something that it made me think out of the box a little bit. It became a collaborative process. I would go there to places I didn't know with people I did not know, and we just kind of made something out of that. And there was something very beautiful about this. And then my circle kept growing. So people would give me the names of their friends and then their neighbors. And then I was getting more requests on Instagram. And then the Boston Globe article got published, and I was flooded with people requesting to be photographed. And for me, this became something more beautiful than making the pictures. People were craving that connectivity and that connection, and there was something really beautiful happening. I would go to these shoots, and there would be sometimes like cards on the door waiting for me, or like chocolate or little trinkets, and there was a connection that was being created that I felt was so important, and something we kind of took for granted before. So I'm going to go through the images, and where most of my work focused on women and children, I'm still drawn to that in this work, but I'm trying to also, there's something about that virus that's not about an age group or a color or religion. It's like we're all in this together, and I tried hard to include different ages, different backgrounds, and everything in that. So and what was interesting, like this is a picture that I made early in the process, and I don't know if you guys remember, but it felt like the first few weeks were very heavy, and eventually it's like became the new normal, and we almost got used to a situation that's not normal. And this for me was very much one of the early photos I made, which there was this heaviness. And as the project evolved, I realized that there was this aspect of performance behind the window. And I let it happen because it was part of the story being told. And these are two identical twin young women I had photographed over the years, and they were always intertwined with each other. And the difference here that I couldn't get close to them, I couldn't hug them, but I felt like I was able to grasp that same intertwining that they always kind of had. This is a woman who I'm so honored to have met. She replied to my post on Instagram. I had never met her. She's in Hingham. She got me to photograph everybody on her street. And she's a photographer herself. She realized which window would be best. And I went there, and that window is on the second floor, even though my request was the first. Was first floor windows. And she had a ladder waiting for me when I got there. So that was very beautiful. That was also like I had photographed everybody on her street and got to her at the end. And I'm so grateful that I got a couple of great photos from that, because I'm used to shooting with my medium format camera, where I would go through the whole summer without having to change a battery. And I didn't realize that with a digital camera, you have to have a bunch of batteries with you. So it died on me, and I had to pack my stuff and go home. So I'm so grateful I got this picture. How are we on time, Glenn? I don't know if I should just keep going or keep talking.
Yeah, you're fine. You still have 5-7 minutes more.
Okay. And then another thing that was happening, usually we're all so busy, and it feels like it's the race to nowhere. And I'm trying hard to always find the silver lining in the situations we're living in. For one, I had my kids at home, and I haven't had my kids at home in a long time, so that was nice. The other thing is it connected me with many people that I also knew and I hadn't seen. And I realized we're always so busy, and we don't make the time often to get out of our way to see people. And here I was just doing that. So this is actually the wife of the son of our old babysitter that my kids had grown up with this family, and all of a sudden I hadn't seen them in years, and it was beautiful to get to do that. And then what I found was interesting that was happening is almost became like there was this aspect that was painterly in some way. Like I'm observing them, but I'm also looking at what they're looking at in some way. so there was something complex happening that I always use mirrors in my work, and I felt like gradually the same kind of thing was happening there. I'm going to go through those. And I feel like it's so hard for these kids being stuck at home. And I don't know, I think we're all doing the best of the situation. Again, that's not natural. And, but I mean, I don't know. And this, for me, this was powerful to see all these kids who are not at school, not in the playground. I mean, maybe now they're starting to be able to get out, but you know, stuck indoors. So I love the fact that you could sometimes see that outside reflected in on some level. And you know, with kids, you cannot pose them in any way. This picture happened after I was done with the shoot and I packed my stuff, and all of a sudden she just started performing and I had to scramble to get my camera out. So I'm glad I was able to get that. So I'm gonna keep going through the images. I think we're almost done. And then some interesting things would happen that sometimes I might not realize on the spot, but realize after. Like, you know, the flowers are inside and the flower pot outside is empty. So there's something kind of sadly ironic about this. So sometimes it's like the edit of the picture where this would start happening. And here I had gone and she was about to sit down on the windowsill and I saw the dress. I'm like, okay, please stay there. And this is a friend of mine I had photographed, and she was always a diva. And I'm like, you know what? We're gonna do it the way we always did it. So, you know, she wore her red dress, the lipstick, the sunglasses. I keep looking at it, thinking, I wish she had a glass of wine as well, like right there. And here, again, it's a matter of letting things happen. I mean, I love what's happening here with the distance. I mean, he was going there to close the curtains, and I'm like, oh my God, please don't move. So there was a sense of, I'm relating to her on a window, and he's on an opposite window to the other side, but I could see the inside of their house through it. And again, the whole sense of the inside and the outside that's getting blurred and gives these effects that are sometimes pretty eerie. And I don't know how many of you know Jess Dugan, the photographer. This is her mother and her wife, the mother's wife. So that was another cool thing where the circle kind of closes and people share contact with each other. And this is the mother of a photographer friend of mine, Tira. Do you know her, Glenn?
Tira Khan?
Yes, that's her mom.
Oh, wow.
So, and I'm ending with this picture because again, I really wanted to be a collaboration. And when I thought I was done with the shoot and I was leaving, and she asked me, can you make a picture for me, for her? And this is where she put those two messages for me. And I'm like, oh my God, that was not for you, that was for me. And I love ending with that photograph because I thought that was pretty powerful, especially with what's happening today. I'm just going to show, this is actually, again, I couldn't believe that I got a page and a half in the Boston Globe on this project when I was barely 3 weeks into photographing that. And, you know, she interviewed me, and then, and I saw the article online, and then my husband called me on Friday morning. It's like, come here. And I get the paper. I'm like, oh my God. So that was beautiful, actually. And this is kind of me and her across the window. Her husband took that photograph. And so this really was fantastic. It got me so many people that I was able to reach out to and photograph. And it was nice for me to get some kind of, you know, you start a new project, you don't know what you're doing. And if it's something that resonates, and that kind of, for me, validated it in some level. So without further ado, I'm gonna give the floor to Barbara, I think. And I think we're doing questions at the end, right?
Right,
So,
right.
okay.
Rania, those were incredibly beautiful, like just stunning.
Thank you.
Okay, Glenn, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be a part of this. And João, I'm looking forward to seeing your work. So I will share the screen. Did you open it up for me to share?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, super
Yeah,
duper. Super. Okay, give me 1 minute. I have to remove this to get to my images. And let's see, what will I start with? Okay. I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. I would say my COVID journey, for lack of a better word. Wait for bar to change next image. Okay. So essentially, right before the COVID hit, I was sort of in the middle of my Guggenheim project where I was making 8x10 film portraits of people who are survivors of gun violence. And I got in my car and I drove all across the country. And it was really one of the most logistically difficult and technically difficult assignments I've ever done. But I left my job at the LA Times 3 years ago to try to shake things up creatively, change the way I was creating. And I just wanted to be re-inspired. So it was the hardest project I'd ever done. COVID hits. This particular series that I'm going to show you now, these are portraits of people made during lockdown in Los Angeles during COVID. And it's been hard to get freelance assignments for this story because a lot of organizations don't want to hire freelancers. They're afraid of the legal implications if someone gets sick and dies. So I felt like I was trapped in my house and I really felt a strong need to create. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just going to go downtown and I'm going to photograph people. I'm going to social distance. I'm just going to photograph people who are experiencing that pandemic. And this is all shot in downtown Los Angeles at the corner of 5th and Broadway. There's a store that shut down, so it has a natural black backdrop for me. It's very similar to how my Guggenheim images look, but these particular images come to me so easily because I just wait for people to walk by. I use a digital medium format camera, and I take one picture of people. And I wanted a really good cross section of people who, you don't see the bar on top of my images, do you?
No.
You just see the images, okay. So I really wanted a good cross section of people who were experiencing this COVID, this pandemic. And so I went from an extremely difficult project to an easier project. And I want to do this almost like passport photos. I'm doing this as kind of portraits of pandemic evidence. For me, the history of this project is sort of the impetus to create this work. And so I look at this as a project that I think will be much more valuable in 40 or 50 years from now when people want to look back and say, how did people look during the pandemic in downtown Los Angeles? What were they wearing? A lot of people have said to me, you know, why don't we have more details about them? Why don't we have their names? Why don't we have the background? And frankly, it's very difficult to do this kind of work. I mean, I am maintaining social distancing. I don't want to get people sick. I don't want them to get me sick. And I decided that I like the ambiguity of not knowing who they are. I like that it's more of an exposition. It's more of a documentary of, you know, what they bring with them, what their belongings are, what they look like. And if I say this girl's name is Mary Jane, it's not going to add to the image whatsoever. But I listened to a few people and I thought, okay, let's get some names like I would normally do as a journalist. But I felt we had to get really close to each other to hear one another because we're all wearing masks. And I just thought, nah, it's too dangerous to do that. So the goal of this project, it's sort of a time capsule for me. And when the stay-at-home order is over, I'll stop making these portraits. And what I want to do is get large poster-size images made and have them plastered all over downtown. Did somebody say something?
Not crazy, all right? Be kind.
Somebody had their microphone on. I just muted it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm just going to let you see these images, all shapes and sizes, all different ages, all different ethnicities. And the goal is to, like I said, just create a time capsule of who these people are. And I can't tell you how rewarding this has been for me from a creative perspective. I love this work. I love meeting people like this. And I'm really looking forward to the second phase of this work when I roll it out and get to showcase it. So let's move into this little section. So I randomly, was called upon to, I got a commercial gig, which was really exciting for me, to work with this particular team as they were doing testing in Northern California. And so I thought long and hard about it. I thought, do I really want to go into these tiny containers with the frontline workers where there will definitely be cases of COVID? Because prior to doing this work, I had been so paranoid about getting sick because I have lung issues. And I just, I find myself in a position where all of my assignments canceled when this crazy COVID thing hit. And I support myself. So when a commercial assignment comes along, I thought, you know what? I'm just going to have to take the risk because I have to support myself. And so I spent kind of like a day in the life with this team. And I'll show you this little monkey suit that I had to wear. But what I also liked about this piece was you weren't getting to see this level of intimacy from the journalists because they weren't allowed to photograph testing centers. They were all photographing this stuff from, with a 400 millimeter lens from across the street. And it felt very, there was no intimacy to a lot of those photos. And I think that added to the fear that we were all experiencing about this disease and how the visuals were sort of exasperating our sense of fear. So my goal with this particular project, I really wanted to humanize this work. I really wanted it to be intimate. I wanted to sort of get rid of the fear in the hopes that people would actually go out and get themselves tested, right? Because that's the only way we're going to control this thing, is if we go out and get tested. A lot of people were very nervous coming to show up to get their pictures, to get, tested. And you're also trying to make images, the good thing about this project, they wanted me to do reportage. They didn't want me to do traditional, traditional commercial work, even though I opened it up with a big sign of the company for their branding. But they really hired me for my reportage work. And they said, this is how we want this documented. We don't want it to look like a commercial campaign at all. So that was really freeing visually because I thought, wow, I'm being paid like a commercial photographer to shoot like a journalist. So I was like, yay, because there is no money in journalism. And so a lot of people have asked me about my protective gear when I'm doing this kind of stuff, and very fortunate. I'm very fortunate that they have given me the whole gear, and it's critical because at one point, they turned to one of the frontline workers turned to their colleague and said this gentleman has COVID, and so it's like, you're right beside the person with COVID. So. I think when you're working in situations where you're covering a disease like COVID, you really have to understand the transmission of the disease, how you can protect yourself. it's sort of critical. So I've gone to this, from this hyper way of protecting myself, covering a story about COVID, to I'm going to take you now to the protests, which I, like everybody else who's covering it, are certainly putting themselves in potentially harm's way, because you got to get the pictures, right? So, and my work is very intimate. My journalism is very intimate. Now, just to start off this story, just to quickly tell you about what happened to me the other day. I was covering the protests in Hollywood. And when I got out of my car, the crowd was just so large and the police looked really aggressive. So I took my skateboard helmet with me and I took my goggles because I wanted to protect myself. And the day was going fine in terms of being able to operate on the scene. I'd never seen the cops that agitated and that out of control at the same time. So being hyper agitated and completely out of control. They couldn't control the looters. They were getting mixed up with the protesters. And so what happened to me was I found myself on a street and the police line was coming down the street. So the line is quite aggressive. They're coming in to sweep. And so this cop says to me, get out of here, get out of here, get out of here. And I said, sir, I'm covering this. I'm a journalist. And he said, I don't care, get the hell out of here. And so I pulled out my press pass and I showed it to him. And he said, I don't give a damn, I told you to get out of here. And then I turned around to get out of there. And he pushed me from behind. And this wasn't just like a little tap. He sent me flying. And so I fell to the ground, hit the back of my head, on the fire hydrant in the sidewalk area, and I was just lying there completely dazed and confused. And then these protesters came out and lifted me up from the ground and sort of pulled me up and helped me get to my to the next burning car that was on fire on the Grove. So part of this COVID story is that journalists are really under fire from the police. So it's quite different from what I've experienced in the United States, not overseas. I've done a lot of conflict photography, but this is so different. So I'd say for about the past 5 days, I've been working all day and all night, just documenting the scenes of what's playing out in my city. And, you know, it was so beautiful to find this moment because it was so intimate. And it was so loving and so caring. And the protesters, I'm so in awe of them, you know. I hate to use the word protesters, you know. I would say demonstrators. They're the youth of our country standing up and raising their voices, and they're being heard. And they're demanding that racism, especially in the police force, is addressed. You're finding all kinds of ages of kids out, like grown-ups, young people. These two kids were on their dad's car, and then the little boy just jumped off. I think this is Hollywood. Again, very emotional. People are taking a knee in solidarity over the death of Mr. Floyd. And then it's so strange to be in Los Angeles and to have these iconic places like, you know, the stars on the ground, and then you've got all these cops, and then you've got everything boarded up. And it's just so strange to see all of this. And then last night in my apartment, I don't live far from downtown Los Angeles, and I had heard what I am familiar with now as these little concussion bombs that the cops dropped. They'd like to disperse the crowd. So they're like shock. They're like, I don't know what they're called exactly, but they set them off, and then that disperses a crowd because everybody thinks they're being shot at. And so I heard them from my apartment from downtown. So naturally I got in my car and I stumbled upon this scene. And the one thing about this particular situation was the cops were actually really nice to me. They gave me access, which is really unusual. So it's nice for me to be able to tell a story from an intimate perspective without a big long lens, and you know, document what's happening. These were kids who were demonstrating all day in downtown Los Angeles at City Hall. And by evening, they decided that they weren't finished, and that's, you know, they're right, but we have a curfew now in Los Angeles by 7 o'clock, and 7 o'clock, if you don't leave, they're going to arrest you. So on this particular roundup, this is on Broadway, right downtown Los Angeles, and it's exactly where I do my portrait series, ironically. These 140 kids got arrested. So when I'm doing this kind of work, you know, everything is fluid. They are completely uncontrolled environments. You don't know from one minute to the next how this situation is going to evolve. But every now and then I look for these situational places that will anchor where this is happening, obviously Hollywood. I find that it's really great to see the incredible gathering of people who are so impassioned and trying to make, you know, our society a better place. Kind of love the kids. And so again, another roundup, we're seeing so many people arrested, so many people. I hope these students, I hope these young folk, I hope they're, you know, I hope it doesn't impact them trying to get into college because they'll have records probably, right? And so this was so unusual, and I think a lot about this when I'm out in the streets, all the homeless people I'm seeing so many homeless people. And it's not only heartbreaking, you also wonder about how they are coping with this. A lot of people on the street have mental illness, and so for them, like seeing all these cop cars and, you know, the National Guard and the California Highway Patrol, and I'm talking hundreds of them, and they're constantly screaming through the streets with their sirens. And this homeless woman, when this gentleman was being arrested, it was incredible. She just opened up her tent and she watched it, and then she just closed it and went back in. And I just thought, God, like what must it be like for them emotionally to be experiencing this? And, you know, like I said, situations are always fluid. You never know how they're going to play out. And so I followed these students. They were protesting in Westwood down near UCLA, and they decided to take over the 401, which pretty gutsy, but also pretty difficult to cover, because once you're with the protesters and you're in thick with them, you're just as vulnerable as they are. And the cops have been firing rubber bullets constantly on every kind of occasion. So it's very tricky to be documenting, protecting yourself, not putting the protesters in jeopardy. And so it's a tricky dance right now. Also, there's so much looting going on. So to be photographing the looters, I don't think I included any pictures in that today. That's also a tricky situation. The looting that's happening in Los Angeles and around the country is really, it's very unfortunate. And the cops, I think, have finally figured out how to handle that situation. And the protesters are very angry at them themselves. And you know, they're trying to control it, but it's very difficult. And so I just roam around. I don't like to be in the pack of journalists, but often I am. But on this particular situation, I was one of the only photographers there. And so it was great to be able to function and make pictures that are important. And a lot of reporters have been interviewing me after being injured, you know, hurt by these idiots. Sorry. Oops, that's another one. Being assaulted by the cops, and they say, why are you still going out? And I say, look, when the person at the top says that journalists are the enemy of the state, how else are the police going to react, right? Because they feel that they're the protectors of the people of the state, and we're the enemies of the state. So it's very, very tricky. But if we do not go out and cover these stories, we're allowing the erosion of democracy to take place. And I, as a journalist, I can't be a part of that. But you also have to understand, I mean, they burned like 20 cars. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. We're also exposing ourselves to COVID as journalists. Now, I'm wearing a mask. You know, I'm doing my best. But if I want people like you all who are a part of this to feel the energy of what's happening in the streets, I need to be close. That's kind of what I do, right? This is right on Fairfax, near the Grove. not a usual situation that we see there. Again, burning cars. This is what I photographed right after I was assaulted. I ran to the end of the street where they were, the cops were there. And so, I just look for moments that will last and deliver information that is really important during this time, because this is incredible history. I just have a few more pictures to show you the chaos with the cops. They just swing with their batons and get into the crowd and fire rubber bullets, as I said. So these kids are really risking, they could lose an eye, they could get hit in the temple. It's amazing what's happening in the streets in Los Angeles. So to go from being cocooned in my house, afraid of COVID, to be like right in the trenches where people aren't really thinking about COVID anymore, right? They're just like, we want to protest, and we want to have our voice. So that's all I have for you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was really extraordinary presentation. And we got 2 for the price of 1 there. We got the COVID and the demonstrations.
Right? I figured it's COVID, right? I mean, it's part of COVID.
It is. All right, João, Pina, you're next. Oh, Barbara, can you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah. My bad. Sorry, gang.
Cool. Hello, everybody. And Glenn, you left me with the hardest task of all, which is to present my work after these 2 amazing women just like killed it. So I basically think I have not much to say or add. Share my gratitude for the work that has been shown. And I think pretty much like Barbara and Rania, my initial scare was how to cover this story and how to put myself at harm's way or not, but being a conscious decision, like we do so many times when we're covering this type of situation, but also out of personal curiosity. I was just like, frankly, I don't like being at home for more than 3 weeks, and now I just stayed at home for 3 months. So I had to find like my own excuses to say I need to go somewhere, and it's not okay to go somewhere just to get some air at this point. So my excuse has been, in my life, I'm interested in something and I use photography to go after that and that interest of mine. So basically I was home in São Paulo. I had just come back from a few months abroad. And this whole thing started to unveil first in Asia, as we remember, then in Europe. And then to me, it was pretty obvious that the Americas was going to be next. The US was hit first, and it's still being hit by COVID. And then most recently, Latin America became the epicenter of this, and most likely Africa will be next. So I've been like following this wave, this tsunami that's like rolling around the world and doing what's happening, and we all following it. So I'm gonna share I'm gonna share what I decided to do. Basically, as I was saying, I was home, and I have moved to São Paulo not that long ago, and it is for a short amount of time that I'm gonna be there. But I knew the city quite well, and I started to think, how can I tell this story without being obvious, without putting myself too much at arm's way, and being in a visually interesting story? Because we all started seeing in January and this whole February, and then this was early March. I was honestly sick of seeing people walking in the streets with masks and doctors in like space suits everywhere. So the images I was seeing were pretty much all the same back then. And I was worried about, okay, when I'm going to go out and like shoot people waiting for the bus wearing masks, is that what I want to do? And it wasn't. So I decided to do what I call a micro story, which is like focus in one place. In this case, I decided to choose this building, which is the Copan building in downtown São Paulo, which became a utopian dream designed in the 1950s by the famous architect Oscar Niemeyer to fit all in one place, pretty much all the spectrums of society of Brazil. So the rich, the poor, middle class, from intellectuals to working class, from very rich to fairly poor. And this became an utopian dream that actually materialized in something. This building was inaugurated in the 60s, and through different phases, it's now home to 5,000 plus people in 1,160 apartments. So it is massive, massive building in a massive city. The people who don't know, São Paulo has the larger area of São Paulo is home to 22 million people. So it's the largest city in South America. And I didn't want to be like jumping around everywhere. So I started to think about this building, and it really clicked on me when I was following the ongoing protests that have been going for 3 months now against Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who is very racist, very similar to what the current president of the United States, Donald Trump, is and states for. But this, as a Portuguese intellectual says, it's Donald Trump without going to elementary school. So you can imagine the level of things and the speech, the hate speech, and the way of like putting things in very simplistic ways. So the protests against Bolsonaro were huge and are still huge in the Copan because it's tendentially speaking a left-leaning residence, and every night at 8:30 p.m. people will just go out and start protesting and hitting their pans. So this is my opening shot. I knew this was happening every night, and I started first with social media and asking friends who was there, and I wanted to photograph them. Again, using a social distance, not being myself at risk, but this is still at a point where we could all do it fairly safely if you follow the measures, if you don't get close, if you wash your hands, if you take your shoes off. So I was doing all that, but I was seeing Rania's work and just like clicking. But at the same time, I wanted to look into these people's lives, inside their houses, how they all look. And this building, every single apartment that I walked into was totally different from each other. So that was fascinating to me. And I knew I wanted to do it. So I started talking to people, and some of them, they were worried. So I would literally like walk into their apartments and just like jump outside of their window into the Brise Soleil, where I could sit and photograph them through the windows. So I did that, for example, in this shot. But most people were okay with my presence and being there and just like keep social distancing and photograph their daily lives. So I went on from fairly fast, and Rania also spoke about it. It was amazing to walk into people's homes and seeing how they weren't seeing anyone or speaking to anyone live for 2 or 3 weeks. So immediately we clicked. I spent like, with this woman, for example, with Caroline, I spent about 3.5 hours sitting on her floor and just speaking to her because she hadn't seen anyone in almost a month. So she was like, really need to speak. So we would speak first. I would get an idea of their lives. And then I would just like start making some photographs and eventually come back if I needed to. Other case, like this guy's here, the one wearing a red shirt, he's a friend. He's actually a photography curator, and I knew we lived there, so they invited me to go over while they were having lunch, and I ended up spending some time there. And this started to click with people and how different lives were happening in this building. And this is 2 different examples. One is of 11-year-old girl living in actually the largest apartment of the Copan building, with about 40 square meters, which is like roughly 4,000 square feet. I think it's 4,000 square feet. It's huge. And they were just like having different living rooms. So the family was absolutely okay and had enough space. In this case, this is another resident living in a very small apartment. This is the bed behind her. And she's like on a diet because she decided I would go on a diet and do exercise every day, which she's still doing. So she took this experience of the quarantine as something of like a journey over our own health. She's taking care of herself, and I was able to like document that a little bit, people just chilling out in their apartments. And this guy here is a very interesting character. He is actually the superintendent of the building, and being a superintendent of a 5,000 resident building means you're a mayor of a small city. And he had previous experience of what was going on with viruses, especially with the H1N1 virus about 10 years ago. So he knew he was prepared when the virus started appearing in China. This building, which is a landmark in Sao Paulo, shut down the rooftop, so there were no visitors, especially tourists, a lot of Chinese tourists and a lot of Asian tourists. And he knew what his people coming were and where they were coming for. So we decided way before the virus arrived to Latin America. On January 30th, they shut down the rooftop, and he started preparing, literally like buying protective suit, alcohol gel, all those things, all those small things that are, and I was there until about a month ago. I was on and off going there. And it was very interesting to see how there were no cases, no confirmed cases in the building. Then now I recently found out there were a couple, but they are confined, and the staff are taking care of everybody who has symptoms. They're checking in on them. So it's really an interesting place and an interesting community. And a big part of that is because of this guy, Afonso, Mr. Afonso, who's 80 years old, and he's still running the show. And he's still getting people ready for these types of situation and saving people's lives, while the president is coming on TV saying this is only a little flu and that we should all go back to work and just produce and let the sick people be at home. And that's it. And as you know, Brazil is now the second country with the most cases. And I think the fourth, it's changing every day, so we never know. I think the fourth with the most deaths. So after the US, after President Trump, it's President Bolsonaro. So it's actually an interesting political game going on here. And I'm very curious to see what the electoral results will be out of this, especially in the US this year. But this is that moment. And I needed to have, I forgot to mention, but I pitched this story to National Geographic. And I was assigned by Geographic to go in and do this for them. And I knew I needed like several images of the building. So just, this is the Copan, and in front of the Copan, there's another interesting building, which I asked friends of friends who could find me a place, a window basically, to go there and shoot, especially because, as I mentioned before, there's these protests going on every night at 8:30, and I wanted to photograph towards the building at that moment to see how were people reacting in their windows. And so for 2 nights, the first one was very frustrating because I got there at 8:30 and one guy came out and hit the pan in the 5,000 building or 5,000 windows, which actually is less, but that's fine. And the next day, Bolsonaro said he was going to speak in public television at 8:30 p.m. So I was, okay, this is my time. So I went back to that apartment and I just waited for the reactions. And this is that moment where people are coming out, hitting their pans, yelling against the government and demanding something to be done, which is to me very interesting. And this is the scale of the building, which I also wanted to have that in those images of like showing how big this whole world is and how everybody's living side by side, yet not touching, not seeing, and not speaking to each other. And then at the same time, I decided I wanted to start photographing some of the 100+ employees of the building. This is the main electrician who actually lives in the building, and it's on call 24/7 if something major happens. And he just like runs this small city in downtown São Paulo. And at the same time, I decided I wanted to photograph portraits, formal portraits of the residents. As I was doing that, I also started to think, okay, I want to have a similar portrait for everybody, pretty much like, I think, inspired by what you were already doing, Barbara. But at the same time, I wanted to show their places, to show their houses. So I did this like 2 portrait session, 2 different portraits, and then just like stayed on with them for a lot longer and just like let life happen while they were doing their thing. I was just trying to be a fly on the wall, which is a hard thing these days, but I think it worked out fine. That, as I mentioned, I was photographing not only the residents, but also the employees. And one day, Afonso, the superintendent, tells me, oh, at 12 every day, this guy, Maurik, comes here and plays the violin for about half an hour. He's basically on his lunch break. He eats fast and he comes down to the painting workshop. He's a painter in the building. And he comes down to the painting workshop and gets the violin and starts rehearsing to play on church on Sundays. So to me, that was fascinating, this little moment. So I went in, I photographed him while he was rehearsing. And then a few days later, I just met him inside of the building painting, and I also followed him around. And then I started asking people what they were doing to avoid, or basically to avoid getting depressed, and like how they were coping with this like confinement in fairly small places. And this guy is actually a pretty good contemporary artist, a young guy called Iles Artusi. And he told me, oh, usually in like late afternoons, I jumped from the window to the Place Soleil where he's sitting to catch some direct sunlight and avoid getting depressed by the lack of vitamin D, and I just read. And so I went back a few days later and just like sat down silently with him and made his photographs while he was reading and catching some sun, which was quite interesting. And this is, again, the scale and the architecture and this weird, very weird building, which is fascinating. Another couple lives in a very different type of apartment, a much larger apartment. And it was interesting to just like get into these snippets of people's lives and trying to not to be my presence, not to be so much invasive in their lives. But I also wanted to photograph the landscape and the fact that São Paulo being so big, and especially because it's landlocked, the level of pollution is usually huge. And a couple of weeks after the mandatory quarantine started, what happened was the air started to clear, and usually you would be seeing blues and tones of like colors that you didn't remember they existed anymore. So I wanted to sort of try to portrait that. And what I did was to ask Afonso to go into the rooftop a couple of times and just photograph from there. And he allowed me. Of course, it was not open to the public, but because I was doing this story, he allowed me to go up, and I just waited and until I could see like the mountains, and like people would barely remember being able to see those mountains up there because fog and pollution just like completely blocked their views most of the year, which was to me interesting. And then like small things as businesses try to survive, and this is a cafe inside it's a residential building, but it has a gallery in the ground floor. And it was interesting to see how this coffee was still open for business, especially to deliver coffee and cakes and sandwiches. But there was this resident that he needed his coffee, and he would just like walk down every day, get social distance, but drink his coffee and go back up to his apartment. So small things like that. People walking their dogs, which was actually a great excuse to get some sunlight. So I met actually several residents just in this is the front door, just walking their dogs and starting having a conversation. And that also got me access to some of these apartments. The galleries that are completely empty, and usually like thousands of people would walk here every day. And now no one knows when it's going to reopen because the situation is so dire right now. And this is one of the people that I met actually walking our dog, and Angelica Cunha. she invited me into her place where she lives with her daughter in a 1-bedroom apartment. And it was, again, I walked outside, jumped outside of the window to the Brise Soleil and just like had her talking to me and like photograph the little moments while you can see. And I played with some reflections. Again, the shut down city and just people walking their dogs. And this was a very interesting couple that I met. She's from Brazil, he's from Spain, and they had just moved together 2 weeks before COVID hit, or the quarantine hit, into this very small apartment in the Copan. They were living together for 2 weeks, and then mandatory quarantine started. So they had been living literally 24/7 with each other, and they had just met a few months before and started dating. And they were very kind to me, so I photographed them, and then I found my way into these emergency stairs so I could see them and see the window and show that too. So that was interesting to focus on. This is another person. She's actually a hotel maid who's on layoff, waiting to be called back in. But she's just like literally hanging out in her smaller apartment with her dog and a friend who sometimes is there. And this is the building. This is the classical view of the Copan and even downtown São Paulo. So this is the size of a huge, huge city, pretty much like LA or Mexico City. This is like the megalopolis of the continent where so many things happen. This is another shot of the famous wave, because there's multiple theories why Niemeyer designed it like that. Some people say it's so the wind can spread and not break the building. Others says it's because there's like a flag and it's the symbol of the city. It's the flag waving. And Niemeyer, and if you know a little bit about architecture, you know about Niemeyer, is just like a character. And this was a day I decided to follow the mailman, because Copan has a zip code of its own, and it has one of their employees. It's the mailman for the building. So he's in charge of the letters and packages for 5,000 people. And I asked him to follow him around, and just like while he was doing his tour, putting letters on the apartments. And this was an interesting moment also. Usually the national health system in Brazil gives elderly people their flu vaccines, but because of the quarantine, they decided to actually come. You wouldn't have to go to your like small health center in your neighborhood. They did decide to come into the Copan and vaccinate the elder, which were about 500 people, so about 10% of the people living in a building. And they gave them the vaccine shot, the flu shot, which is obviously not for COVID, but it helps to avoid other problems, which is good. And winter is arriving in Brazil right now. So that's a whole different conversation. And then in the second, so I stayed a week or 8 days straight in the building. I moved there, I rented an apartment and just moved there so I wouldn't have to go in and out and avoid maximum my going out of the building. And then I went back home, edited, filed to the magazine, and I decided after another 2 weeks of self-quarantining at home, I wanted to go back and to continue to shoot. But now my eye, I think, was a little bit more sharp, and I was looking for special characters that way. And this is a quite famous Brazilian fashion designer, Valerio Araújo. And I got in touch with him. I explained what I was doing. We had some friends in common, and he let me in. He hadn't seen anyone in a long time, but he was still at home frenetically creating. And I was very interested in that. So I just asked him to do his thing, literally. And while he was doing his thing, I was just like being the fly on the wall and photographing his life. And then I asked him to pose for me, to pose for a portrait. And he was super fond of that. And we had a lot of fun for maybe an hour or more, just like he was changing his clothes and impersonating people. So it was fun to hang out with him. And from that on,
we can bring this to a close soon. We only have about 15 minutes left for questions.
It'll take me 3 minutes. I'm just going to finish here and explain a little short series I had been doing. This was another resident that I was following, and this was the problems revolving around the building. So the building is inside of downtown, and the downtown areas where most of the homeless people, and especially the people addicted to crack, live. And because beforehand, with normal activity, they would get like the leftovers from the restaurants and pity money from walker-bys. Now they were on their own because there was no one on the street. So they were starting to starve. And some of these residents went out, they crowdfunding between them in the building, and they went out, bought food, and started giving food away to the people without home, living in the surroundings of the coal pond. So this is the last image on that. And again, there's like landscape, never-ending landscape of the city, and the building on it. And just to finish, I'm just gonna browse through. While I was doing this, I wanted to do like a very simple idea, and I wasn't finding it yet until I started going in and out of these people's houses and finding that the rugs, the doormats on their doors were amazing, and they told me so many different things about these people. So I literally started walking around the corridors of the building, just photographing the doormats and how I could imagine the person living the door, which is just like on our top frame, it's the door. And I could imagine just by the messages, just by the little details on the doormats, who was on the other side of the door. That was like my own personal trip on this. So I did like first day, or one of the first times I photographed this, I did like 10 shots. The next day I did like another 10 shots. And as soon as, to me, this worked out visually, I decided I wanted to do a whole series on it. So I literally, right now I have about 500 pictures of these. I literally walked like, for I think now about 800 or 900 apartments, just looking at the floor and photographing the rugs or the doormats. And it's been quite interesting and fun just to like go, and sometimes I have a laugh on my own because I look like a crazy person. I just like walk along empty corridors looking at the floor and taking a very simple picture. So I'm wondering how the like security personnel who's looking at me on the camera is like, what is this guy doing? But I think the series became like an interesting one. So I'm just gonna go. This is Vai embora, which is go away. And this is my message for COVID and corrupt politicians out there. That's pretty much it. So I'm just going to stop sharing.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And thank all of you for an incredible presentation. In the interest of time, I'm just going to open it up to questions from the audience rather than me asking questions. I have a lot, but let's just go directly to the audience. If you have a question, you'll need to click the participant button at the bottom of your screen. It'll open up a window and you'll see a button to raise your hand. So click the button to raise your hand and I'll take questions in the order that I see the hands raised. So Rania is only here for another 3 minutes. She has to leave early, but so she's gonna duck out. But I see that Kent Fairfield has had a question up for the last 45 minutes. So Kent, why don't you start the discussion or the question?
Thanks very much. Thank you. Hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
I have a question for Rania. I'm stunned by the projects you showed, and having tried to do a certain amount of portraits on the streets myself, what did you do about getting model releases from both the people in the testing as well as in the wonderful windows?
Well, I'm the worst person to ask because I don't get model releases. And I'm not telling you not to do that. I think people should do this, but I stopped doing that a long time ago. I felt like it almost got in the way of the relationship I was creating with people. I made it clear that the work could be exhibited or published as long as it's part of my work and part of my project, but that it's not going to be sold for commercial purposes for like a shampoo ad or whatever. And as long, and I think people got it. So I think it's a question of trust at this point. As long as you treat people with respect and you present them well, I think you're fine. So, and I had a bad experience in Lebanon with somebody who, once I gave her the model release, she started wanting to get a lawyer and she was calling her husband and she's freaked out. And I'm like, you know what? I don't need this. So I don't need to do that shoot. I don't need to get into this. So I think sometimes I found that it scared people sometimes. I'm just going to add, because I saw that there was a question that kept coming about how much I give instructions or I direct people. I don't direct very much, but when you're photographing across the window, there's a lot of areas where there's a lot of reflection. You might not see the person. So I tend to ask people to go in a certain place so I could see them. Otherwise, sometimes, especially if it's in direct sunlight, the person would disappear in the reflection completely, which sometimes is cool, but I try to get the eyes at least. I thought at first it's going to be like a quick, but I would go take a picture and leave, but it actually turned into a photo shoot and a connection across the window. So I would spend a good 45 minutes to an hour with each person. So I let them kind of bring their own identity to the project as well, and you find that the longer you spend with people, the more they kind of let go and let it happen. So if it turned into a performance, I let it happen. I might direct people in the sense that I like to see hands, if you notice. So I keep telling people, I would love to see your hands, or like maybe look at me or don't look at me, but I let it be about them besides that, if it makes any sense.
Very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't want to jump into anybody else, but if anybody has a question for me, I do have to go. I'm sorry about that.
If somebody has a question for Rania, just jump in right now. Just unmute your microphone and ask it.
How do you pick the people that you photograph?
For my earlier work, I would pick people on the street or whatever, and it was something about the person that would catch my eye, and I'm like, oh, I'd love to photograph this person. And I don't know what it is, and there's something about the attitude or whatever, and I kind of somebody I could relate to on some level. This new project I'm doing, I'm trying to do it differently, where I'm photographing anybody who's willing to be photographed, because I feel this is not anymore, this is about all of us being in that same boat. Everybody's needing that connection to be made or whatever. I don't use all the images, or I'm gonna find a way maybe to use them, but now like here I'm showing about 20. I photographed already 112 people. So I'm trying to open it and to get out of my own way of just focusing on young women, because all my work had focused on the ages of my daughters. And here I'm trying to make it about anybody who wants to be. If anybody lives in Boston and want to be photographed, email me.
All right, thanks, Rania.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thanks, João and Barbara and everybody for coming. And I apologize. I have a daughter who graduated, and we have graduation events happening all the time. So I have to dash out of here. But thank you so much.
And we will keep this discussion going. Thank you, Rania.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, if people would like to ask a question, I would suggest you use the raise your hand button, which is available in the participant button at the bottom. I don't see any hands raised now, but let me ask a question. João, you had done this work earlier on in COVID, I think. It was in April when things were just really starting to heat up.
Late March, early April, it's when I started.
And since that time, the numbers have just gone off the charts in Brazil. What would things look like now in the Copan building?
That's a good question. So the numbers were already pretty high, and the thing with the Brazilian numbers is you can't really trust them because there's barely any testing going on. So the numbers right now are about 500,000, and there are studies saying that it should be between 7 times and 12 times more than that. So we're talking about a major thing. It was already pretty obvious that was going to happen first, because the virus entered, it's funny enough, from wealthy people who had gone on winter vacation, or in their case, summer vacation, to Europe, mostly Italy, and came back infected. So it came from the higher classes. But then obviously the people who were working for them got infected, and they brought it home back to the very poor neighborhoods, which social distance is pretty much impossible. So now that is one case, and the second is the fact that the president is still saying that this is a little fluke, and people should go back to work. So a lot of people, and we're talking about 30%, are still pro-Bolsonaro, and people like thinking that what the president says should be taken to the letter, are going out and are just like, yesterday they were doing a party, Sunday, I'm sorry, they were doing a party, and it's just like, went against a doctor who was trying to sleep for a few hours before going back to the front lines and work, and they just attacked her and broke her knee. So this is the level of violence and like by all means that's happening in Brazil. And to be totally honest, after going to the Copan, I came back home, stayed safe, went back to the Copan and just like went back home, and then eventually left São Paulo, and I'm now in Lisbon since 3 days ago in Portugal. So the situation is pretty dire, but no one really knows the extent of it because there's no testing and the numbers are not reliable. But hospitals are mostly, in most cases, completely full. The governors and the mayors of the city are imposing rules, but the president is saying that everybody should go out and just continuing on their own.
Crazy.
Yes.
So I don't see any hands raised. So would anybody just like to jump in and ask a question? If not, Barbara, I have a question for you, Barbara. I mean, when COVID hit, it was like the most cataclysmic thing that has happened to this world in 100 years. Like it was just, it's hard to get our mind around how this has changed the whole world. And then very quickly in the past week, the same thing has happened in this country after the death of the murder of George Floyd. And now this is this whole other cataclysmic historical event happening. And you're doing both. Like, how do you deal psychologically with these two major historical events going on simultaneously, and either keeping them separate, or are they one and the same thing? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think that I'm so in deep in this story right now that's playing out in Los Angeles, this more of a spot news story. I'm so in deep that I don't have time to think about the bigger picture. I'm mostly operating in a reactive bubble. Like now we're sitting here talking, I'm like, I gotta go, I have a 3 o'clock protest I've gotta get to, you know? So I was thinking about that this morning, how I've completely compartmentalized everything. But yesterday I saw a moment when a Black man hugged the cop. And honestly, I thought at first it was just the police trying to change the narrative, you know, making these sort of kind gestures in front of the media because they've been getting such bad press. But when I saw this man hug this cop, like, it was so moving. It really kind of took my breath away, and I had to catch myself because I was really becoming overwhelmed with, like, it was just so emotional. So I can't give into how I'm feeling when I'm working, because otherwise I won't be able to. Like, I'm getting maybe 3 hours of sleep a day. You know, working all day, working all night, transmitting into the wee hours, and up in the morning, figuring out what's going on. You know, I don't have the infrastructure of the LA Times behind me anymore, where they tell me where to go, what to do, who to speak to, blah, 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 blah. I'm kind of figuring it all out as I go. I kind of miss my COVID project, my portrait series, to be honest with you. I really love that. And I'm so hopeful that I don't have this disease. I'm not seeing anybody that I know. I haven't seen any of my friends, but I'm diving into protests that have 1,000 people who are screaming in your face, you know, but I'm protected. I'm being smart, but it's a pandemic. So, you know, I can't think about it too much. Otherwise I can't operate. I'd be in my house all day, which I can't do either, because I'll be homeless in 6 months if I do that. So, you know, it's a difficult situation.
Do you think you're going to go back to the COVID portraits?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I really want to get back to them. I can't do that right now, but I definitely want to go back to them. For sure. I love making those portraits so much. And it's just so random. Like, I wait to see when people walk by me. I just say, that person looks visual. It's sort of instinctive, right? And I just say, hi, I'm doing this portrait. It's like a time capsule. It's for history. It's a pandemic evidence. Can I take your picture? And they're like, yeah. And they just stand there and just one frame, and then they're gone. So it's fascinating. It's really fascinating.
Any other questions out there?
I think there were a couple of people just posted here in the chat. My raise my hand function is not working. Andrea Zocchi and
Oh, I don't know.
Just
Okay.
wave then. Just wave. Well, we can't see everybody.
Andrea, do you want to just pipe in? We can't hear you, Andrea.
How about now?
Yeah.
I had a question for Barbara. Barbara, how does what you're seeing compare to some of the conflict work that you've done abroad, in the sense that, you know, the riots and the demonstrations, and just kind of your general gut feeling to how does this compare to other areas that you've kind of had to photograph?
Right. Well, I would say last Saturday in the Grove area, that was complete pandemonium. The cops hadn't figured out logistically how to handle both the protesters and the looters, right? So they just treated everybody the same, and they were just shooting like crazy into the crowds, rubber bullets. I'd never seen anything like that. It was complete pandemonium. The fact that they threw me to the ground, didn't care that I was holding a press pass, like they were on fire. And it was so, it was such a volatile situation. You know, I was on the one hand shocked that this was happening in the States, but on the other hand, I had been in similar situations overseas, so I could process the fear and continue to operate, but I really had to be cognizant constantly of my own welfare. And in that sense, I was just as vulnerable as the protesters. And you know, that's unusual. There's no protective shield anymore for journalists. And I would say, though, that we probably won't see a day like Saturday again in Los Angeles. The cops seem to have navigated logistically how to handle the looters versus how to deal with the protesters. Like, they're allowing the protesters to do their thing. When looting happens, they're actually following them in helicopter surveillance, getting plates from cars, and they're going to their houses and they're getting them. So they've finally learned how to handle the looters, and the looters have been so incredibly smart logistically in how they've been able to outsmart police departments all across the country. But people are figuring out their tactics now. The police have finally figured out the looters' tactics. And it doesn't feel as volatile in the streets anymore. Like every now and then something acts up, right? Like a gang member will come up, try to inflame the situation, so all the cops come to him, that area. And so his friends can go loot. But they're not falling for that anymore. Not as easily. It's incredible to see all this.
Okay, look, I don't see any other questions, and it's after 3:30, so let me say thank you, really, to our presenters. It was really fascinating presentations and work. And thank you all for being here. It's the biggest Zoom meeting we've had. It's great to see so many people with a successful meeting like this.
Beautiful work.
Last question.
Thank you so much. Beautiful work. Stunning.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody. I'll just keep this open while people kind of sign out and wave and say goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Hi, Mary Beth.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you, Barbara. Ciao.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you to the presenters.
Lou, good to see you there, Lou.
Thanks a lot, Glenn.
Audrey, good to see you there.
Thank you very much. Take care.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm gonna click the off button. Bye-bye, everybody.